technology has not defeated geography. What's happened, though, is that technology has shrunk geography. It's made the world smaller, more claustrophobic, and therefore more anxious. Think of the world now, because of road infrastructure, container shipping infrastructure, obviously cyber digital connections, as all on a taut webwork. And if you pluck one string in the web, the whole network vibrates. What that means in terms of the map is that crises like in the Baltic Sea, the greater Black Sea basin, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, all are interconnected in a way that they haven't been before. I would almost say that as Europe disappears, Eurasia coheres. We now have to think about Eurasia as one conflict system. That doesn't mean war, it just means rivalries and intense interactions. If years ago it was thought that globalization would bring peace and harmony, it does a little of that, but it does something else. Globalization, by causing integration, creates more and more points of interaction. And from those points of interaction, you get flare-ups, you get political crises, etc. So the more interactions through pathways of roads, bridges, railways, ports, fiber optics, the more flare-ups and the more nervous and anxious in a military sense the world becomes. And by the way, something else. We've had decades of capitalist-style prosperity in many parts of the world. And when countries build up their economies, they don't necessarily get peace and harmony. History shows that what they tend to do is build militaries. They build great navies, air forces, ballistic missile systems, because issues of status enter into it. As wealthier countries, they trade more with the outside world. And because they trade more, they have security concerns that they never had before. So by the way, it is no contradiction that Asia, East Asia, which has seen 35 years of double-digit economic growth, is now encountering a high-end arms race. Whenever I go to Asia, I see two things: submarines and shopping malls. And the two actually go together. Let me give you a geographical description of what this means. Let's look at India and China, okay? For most of history, with the exception of Middle Antiquity, when Buddhism spread from the Indian subcontinent into what is now China, and during the 19th century Opium Wars, you had relatively little interaction between India and China. They emerged as two great world civilizations separated by the high wall of the Himalayas. But look now. You have an Indian intercontinental ballistic missile system targeting on many Chinese cities. You have Chinese fighter jets in Tibet that can include the Indian subcontinent in their arc of operations. You have Indian warships increasingly in the South China Sea, and you have Chinese warships increasingly in the Indian Ocean. And you have China building ports throughout the Indian Ocean surrounding India. So what do you have? You have the defeat of distance by way of military technology, and that has created a new geography of rivalry between India and China that never existed before. So if you think of this phenomena going on throughout the world, you can see how the map still matters. It's still the beginning of knowledge. As I like to say, all knowledge of political affairs, geopolitics, it begins with geography, but of course it ends with Shakespeare. Meaning the other 50% is what's not the subject of today's talk. It's human passion, decisions, taken during crises. It's all the Shakespearean elements that make history. So that's 50% of reality, but let me get back to the other 50%, which we tend to overlook in this digital technological age where we think geography's been defeated, when in fact all that's happened is the world is more anxious than ever before. I said Europe is disappearing. What I meant by that is during the Cold War, at least in Western Europe, you had dull, happy decades that were brought about by a number of things. But one of the things that it was brought about was Western Europe's separation from North Africa and the Middle East. Because North Africa and the Middle East, by and large, were locked up in totalitarian prison states so that their peoples had no chance to migrate. So the myth was created that Europe's border ended at the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was the southern extreme of Europe. Well, that was false. It was always false. You had a great early mid-20th century geographer, French, Fernand Braudel, who always said that Europe's southern border, historically, is not the Mediterranean, but it's the Sahara Desert. And that North Africa would eventually be integrated into Europe in good ways and in bad ways, because what we'd be returning to eventually would be the old Roman Mediterranean map of antiquity, where the Mediterranean was the center of Europe rather than the southern extreme of it. And the fringes of the Sahara Desert is now where refugee and migrant caravans organize for their assault into Europe proper. And by that, I don't just mean refugees from the violent turmoil in the Middle East. I mean the fact that sub-Saharan Africa has a population of a little over 1 billion, but by the end of the century could have a population as large as 3 or 4 billion, even though the population of indigenous Europeans stays flat. And so what that means is increasing throughout the century African migration into Europe. You say, well, wait a minute. Aren't African countries experiencing high economic growth rates like Ethiopia and Cote d'Ivoire and others? Yes, but when people are no longer peasants and they start to get a little wealthy and they go into the lower middle classes, they have a chance to migrate in a way that they didn't before. They have the freedom to leave, ironically, even though that they're wealthier. And so they vote with their feet. Remember, when I talk about geography, it's not only the map. The map is not where knowledge ends, but it's surely where it begins. And I mean geography in the 19th century term, meaning that from the map you explore landscape, mountain ranges, ports, river systems, but then you explore the human beings on the map, the ethnic groups. Because what is an ethnic group? What is culture? Culture, historically, is the experience of a particular people over hundreds and thousands of years on a particular geography. And that particular unique experience leads to cultural traits. So again, even when we're talking about culture, it begins with the map. So Europe is disappearing. It's dissolving into the Mediterranean world, both North Africa and Southern Europe. Also, the European Union, geographically speaking, has been a very ambitious enterprise in a way you never read about. Because what the European Union has sought to do is it has sought to govern and apply a single system on countries that were part of Charlemagne's empire, the Prussian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Byzantine and Ottoman Turkish empires. 4 or 5 different empires, 4 or 5 different cultural, imperial, economic experiences, different developmental experiences. It's not an accident that the most troubled economically and institutionally countries in Europe are in the former Byzantine Ottoman Southeast. Greece, with its Great Depression, with its depression of the last few years, and Bulgaria, which is officially in NATO, officially in the EU, but weak institutions infiltrated by the Russians and being fought over by the Russians and the Turks. It's not an accident. So Europe is still very different, with a lot of variety inside of it. You look at the Balkans, Romania, Croatia, Slovenia have all been relative success stories over the last quarter century. Even with Slovenia's banking crisis and others, they've been relative success stories. But the rest of the Balkans, because those countries fell either partially or wholly in the Habsburg-Austrian Empire. But you get down to the former Byzantine Ottoman lands, meaning the rest of the former Yugoslavia, Greece, Bulgaria, you have far weaker systems, semi-failed states, in other words. Let's move on. Let's move across Eurasia a little bit. Let's talk for a minute or two about the Middle East. The Middle East I divide up into 2 kinds of states. One I call age-old clusters of civilization, and the other I call just vague geographical expressions. The age-old clusters of civilization are Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt. Tunisia is still Greater Carthage. If you've ever traveled in the northern third of Tunisia, I'll bet you were traveling along a road that was originally laid by the Romans in antiquity. It has a state mentality, a state identity that's separate from that of Islam and separate from that of the Arab world. So when the Arab Spring happened, Tunisia had lots of turmoil, but there was never a question of the state existing. It was only a question of who would rule. The state itself was secure, albeit weakened. Same with Egypt. Egypt has had upheaval, regime change, but at the end of the day, Egypt is still Egypt because it's the gift of the Nile going back 4,000 years. That's what I mean by age-old clusters of civilization. But then you have what I call just vague geographical expressions. Libya, Iraq, Syria, Yemen. Those countries, because they were artificial to begin with, because their borders did not cohere as naturally with old states, the way Tunisia, Egypt, and Morocco did, required a much more extreme form of totalitarianism. As a journalist, what I like to say, I've spent 30 years as a foreign correspondent, and I trust my eyes, and I trust other commentators who've actually, who have eyes-on contact with a place. And I can tell you, I covered Iraq in the 1980s when nobody was focusing on Saddam Hussein much. I covered Syria, Tunisia. Going from Iraq or Syria to Tunisia or Egypt, even though Tunisia and Egypt were dictatorships was like coming up for liberal humanist air. I mean, that's how much more moderate were the dictatorial regimes in Tunisia and Egypt compared to Syria and Iraq. And the same I could say about Libya. The map shows a completely artificial state that required extreme forms of authoritarianism in order to hold it together. So, and then you have what I call the most natural empire in the Middle East, Iran. Iranians, if you've traveled through Iran as I have, Iranians have a civilizational sense of themselves to the same degree of Indians or Chinese. There's no artificiality in Iran. Iran was the first superpower in antiquity. It's been a state on the Iranian plateau for 2,500 years. And so Iran is eternal. It will always exist. It may have political turmoil. The current regime may change at some point, but we will always have to deal with Iran. I would not say the same for Saudi Arabia, which is far, far more artificial than Iran. Again, the map, if you look at a map of the Persian Empire, anyone, Achaemenid, Median, Parthian, etc., you would see a map of these empires from ancient times would more or less approximate where Iranian influence is now, from the Mediterranean to Western Afghanistan. Central Asia. Oh, by the way, Turkey also has an imperial mentality going back to the Seljuks and the Ottomans and is not at all artificial. Turkey and Iran are strong states, much stronger than even Egypt and Tunisia. Turkey could have turmoil. It had a coup attempt last summer, but the Turkish language on the Anatolian plateau, again, is eternal in history. In a way, many of these Arab states are not. When we look at Central Asia, what we see is that ordinarily, Central Asia should be an area where Iranian influence is very strong. But it's not. It's actually quite weak. Why is that? Because Iran's Islamic identity turns off Central Asians who still to this day are affected by the secularism of the Soviet Union. That Iran should be an attractor pole, but it actually isn't. So when we look at Central Asia, we see the influence of the Chinese. But the Chinese are beating the pants off the Russians in Central Asia, truly. We see one belt, one road, China's new Silk Road network. What is that all about? It's three things. Or a few things. It's a branding mechanism for building roads, railways, pipelines throughout Central Asia for the last decade, by which China can get oil and natural gas from Central Asia directly into Western China because the Strait of Malacca, connecting the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea, is only a few miles wide. And China does not trust it. China feels it's getting too much of its oil through that narrow umbilical cord of the Strait of Malacca and needs alternative geographic pathways into China for its energy. And that's what One Belt, One Road is about. It's also about containing the Turkic Uyghur Muslims in Western China. China has a principal ethnic problem. It's less so with the Tibetans because the Tibetans are sophisticated. They have a cosmopolitan, sophisticated leadership, the Dalai Lama, who meets with global elites. But the Uyghur Turkic Muslims in Western China do not have this. They're much more of an unformed, unpredictable force, and China is terrified of Uyghur terrorism. Of it linking up with terrorism elsewhere in the Muslim world. So what is China doing? One belt, one road. Surround the Uyghurs by having close political and economic relationships with other countries in Turkestan like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc. So that the Uyghurs are surrounded by both Chinese allies to the west and China itself to the east. Also, this One Belt, One Road, Silk Road network raises the standard of living in the Uyghur Turkic areas themselves, and at least potentially the Chinese hope will make them less liable to revolt. So again, we're back to geography in a way. Word about Afghanistan. The United States military cannot win in Afghanistan. The most it can do is save face. That is because Afghanistan is vast, It's geographically separate by mountain ranges, and all the troops in the world can't contain it. I've traveled through Afghanistan over a dozen times between the early 1970s and just a few years ago. And getting from place to place, when you're there, you realize no outside power can govern it. So what's going on? The Chinese want to build a spur line of the Silk Road network from Western China south all the way through Pakistan to Gwadar, a Chinese-built port on the Indian Ocean, where China hopes to stabilize Pakistan and have feeder networks into eastern Afghanistan, where it'll be the Chinese who stabilize and economically develop Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the Indians and the Iranians have a competing route. They're building a transportation oil pipeline network from Chabahar in southeastern Iran on the Indian Ocean, north through western Afghanistan, all the way into oil and natural gas-rich Central Asia. Two countries on each of these routes lined up against each other, showing how geography still rules, and with 15 years of American military involvement in Afghanistan, it doesn't add up to much. Let me just conclude by defining the United States of America in a way you've probably never heard, in a geographical military sense. And it's very simple. When you take a step back and you look at the US, what do you see? You see a great naval power. You see a maritime power with a 300 warship navy that basically helps protect the liberal world order by making all the oil and natural gas choke points at the Persian Gulf, the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, the Strait of Malacca, safe for container ships, and therefore to allow globalization to happen in the first place. So what the United States has to do, and this is my final point, the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere in a strategic sense. So it has to make sure that no one power dominates the Eastern Hemisphere. And that is what American geopolitics is about. And it does that, hopefully more peacefully, by emphasizing the Navy over the Army. And that will be a great geographical, geopolitical drama of the coming years. Thank you.
Is there a future in the concept of countries?
There's a contemporary French philosopher, Pierre Menon, who some of you may have read and heard of, who emphasizes that cities and empires are eternal in human history, if you think about it. Whereas states are only a few hundred years old, going back to the end of the 30 Years' War in the mid 17th century. So states are more artificial than city and empire. Well, you say, but empires don't exist anymore. But in a way, they do. I mean, the American-led liberal world order is empire by another name, which has existed for 75 years. Now the engine may be dying. It may be running out. If you look at what is the root of Chinese, Russian, Turkish, and Iranian power, it's still their imperial mentalities. So I would say states can exist and prosper, but do not take them for granted.
Why is China, by your estimation, winning this so-called battle of empires?
Because ultimately, the Chinese state, and I've traveled throughout China and Russia, and one thing I can tell you, I've traveled with my wife throughout central and western China. We felt completely safe. It's a well-organized, well-run, efficiently maintained, enlightened authoritarian regime. The Chinese are businessmen. They'll hack your computer, they'll hack your iPhone, but they won't beat you up because of something that you wrote. They're like French waiters, kind of. The Russians are different. The Russians are more disorganized, chaotic, thuggish, and guess what? They have a much, much weaker economy. China, even though its growth rate is coming down, still you cannot compare it with Russia, which its economy has been weakening over the last decade or so. Demographically, it's failing, so that Russia could potentially be, in the decades to come, a low-calorie version of Yugoslavia.
Robert, it's great to have you here, and it's a personal pleasure to be on the same stage with you.
Thank you.
When I look around the world, I see that there's a global war unfolding in front of our eyes, and I think there are two dimensions. One is a human dimension, countries fighting countries. Well, actually the most powerful players fighting each other, which is nothing more than a scramble for the precious natural resources. And the other one is that it seems to me that humanity decided to wage war against nature, and nature decided to fight back. It doesn't matter which one we are talking about, the consequences somehow connected. What we see is that people are on the move, and not just millions, tens of millions, but we are talking about hundreds of millions of people. Some people because of poverty, some people because of conflict and violence, and some people are just a step away from being pushed off the land just by inflation or the next drought. So my question would be, if these trends continue, how do you think it would redraw, repaint the maps? And by maps, I mean the word as we know.
I think the key factor in the coming decades that's undisputed, that we know is going to happen, is migration. We already live in a world where 1 billion of the 7 billion inhabitants live in a country that's not their country of birth. And we have hundreds of millions who cross borders every year. And these trends are increasing. They're not decreasing. So we live in an age of migration. As I said when I talked about African demographic rates versus European. So migration is going to be a factor. And although the population growth rate of humanity is coming down, in absolute numbers, we're putting more people on the earth than ever before. And that leads to a degradation of soils, of the environment. The slightest raising of the water level could lead to greater alkalinity in the soil in like Bangladesh and the Nile Valley, which leads to falling crop production and all kinds of second and third order effects. So I think that environmental security will be a key, will define the 21st century. Actually, though, we're not at war. China and America are rivals. Russia and China are rivals. America and Russia are rivals. There are places where we have wars, but we have not seen great power wars since 1945. We've seen proxy wars, but not great power wars. Whether one will occur, I'm very hesitant to predict. As I get older, there's more I realize I don't know, and I'm much, much more hesitant to predict the future.
My question maybe go back a little bit to your sub-Saharan Africa comments. And you said that empires last, and I tend to agree with that. I think that states seem to be more fleeting and artificial. Cities and empires last. But let's talk a little bit about the kingdom of Koosh and some of these ancient empires in sub-Saharan Africa that have apparently disappeared. And these were mercantile empires, and these were powerful places that were extremely advanced for their time. What's the definition of this? Or is this a resurgence of that?
Well, let's take Ethiopia, for example, which in the late 19th century and early 20th, even up until 1974 when Haile Selassie was murdered, was an empire. In the sense that the Amharas lorded it over the Eritreans, the Tigrayans, the Oromos, and others. It was an Amhara-dominated empire, and that was an ancient kingdom. It was Solomon was there. The language of Ethiopia, Amharic, is as close to Hebrew as it is to Arabic. You know, I've always called the Horn of Africa really part of the Middle East that happened to get dislodged onto the African mainland. And so you have a written language going back 4,000 years there. You have a real imperial mentality in Addis Ababa. And that is one reason that accounts for Ethiopia surging now with 7% economic growth rates, with more and more stability, institution building. You know, there are links you can tie from the past to help explain the future. I mean, why is Mozambique and Tanzania doing so well? Because they're part of the Indian Ocean prosperity sphere, which was part of the old Omani Empire.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Thank you.
Hi, my question is not so much connected to geography, but it's connected to power. And my question is, there is this trend going on that we can see where opinion and meticulously put articles by journalists, foreign policy think tanks is not so much being considered when people are making arguments, and people dismiss them as fake news or fake articles or whatever. Yeah. So my question to you is, how can we somehow bring the trust back, the trust of trusting experts, or trusting what they say and what they write? They write it because they went to schools, they worked on it, so they have the knowledge of history, of geography, and of everything. So how can we somehow bring back this trust in experts and expertise?
You see, the United States was a very impressive democracy in the print and typewriter age. It's unclear that it will be an impressive democracy in the video digital era. And I think the video digital era is a challenge to democracy because of what you indicated, because the economics of journalism in the digital age does not allow for the high reporting budgets that allow, because I grew up as a foreign correspondent at a time when the New York Times and the Washington Post and others had permanent correspondents in 40 places around the world, where they paid them high salaries, paid for their kids to go to private schools in those countries. And these were top-notch journalists, who you couldn't tell who they vote for, by reading their articles. This is gone, or it's going. It's disappearing, because the budgets aren't there to support that. And increasingly, we have low-budget journalism. And low-budget journalism is a world of opinion rather than reporting. And that is the real challenge. Now, this may right itself over time. I mean, the development of movable type by Gutenberg, I believe, led to the 30 years, was a reason, in evoking the 30 Years' War. So, but eventually, the print developed, and you got real responsible writing and things. But to me, it seems that the digital age, at least at this level, is a factor for insecurity and for instability. It makes countries and the world less stable, because it not only provides for news that isn't true, but it makes it harder to govern. It makes it much harder to govern the 24-hour, undisciplined, unfact-checked news cycle. Imagine what it's like now to be a national security advisor in one country compared to 35 years ago. Whatever the challenges then, they're much greater now.
Thank you.
So you are making a very strong case for empires instead of clumsily defined nation states. So, in very short, would most people in the developing world would be better off living in empires, or should a tendency to more imperial ways would be welcoming and would be, good for peace and security over there?
Yeah, well, here's the issue. Empires are gone, but they're not coming back in a formal sense. And because they're not coming back in a formal sense, that's one factor that explains all the instability we have. In other words, how would I define the Middle East? For the first time in modern history, the Middle East is in a post-imperial phase. The Ottoman Turkish Empire is gone. The British and French mandate system is gone. The post-imperial strongmen like the Assads, the Gaddafis, Saddam Hussein are gone. And the Americans are less and less of a factor than compared to 25 or 30 years ago. So imperial systems have all collapsed, and that's one of the reasons why you have all these state failures in the Middle East. Imperial systems, though, will never come back officially. That's what's unique about this time in history. It's the first time in human political history when all the intellectual elites, journalistic, policy, academic, have basically declared empire illegitimate. And therefore, it will not come back, but what I'm saying, it's still a factor in an undeclared sense. If you want to find out why the Iranians are so sophisticated in their negotiating tactics, why the Chinese have this vision of a Silk Road network, etc., it's because of the experience of empire in Iran and in China.
My question would be, in one of our books you wrote that about Russia, that those countries who are on an invasion route or who are hard to defend their border, that tends to prefer more strong leaders. And in this sense, the Central and Eastern Europe is very similar because they have borders without any natural defense. So how do you see the situation of the Central and Eastern Europe? Because from my perspective, they seem to be very different.
Yes. Look, the Russians have been invaded by not just Hitler and Napoleon, but by Swedes, Lithuanians, Poles, Teutonic Knights, etc., throughout history. And Putin has this in his bones. So but he knows he cannot recreate the Warsaw Pact. That would be too expensive, and the Warsaw Pact failed. So what he's trying to do is create a soft zone of imperial influence from the Baltic states in the north to the Balkans to Bulgaria in the south through subversion, running organized crime networks, running intelligence operations, buying media through third parties, buying off corrupt politicians, using cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, all ways that are deniable, but which are effective in order to soften up and weaken Central Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Each country has its own different, experience with this. Some countries are much stronger than others. But this is basically the Russian tactic. And I would say that a country like Hungary or Poland, as strong as they are, or as better off as they are compared to Bulgaria or Macedonia or Kosovo, is still not nearly as well developed in terms of bureaucracy and institutions as, say, France or Germany. So a country like France or Germany can have a high degree of multiculturalism. It's hard, a country like Hungary or Poland or others feel more threatened by it. And it ultimately goes back to where these countries sit on the map.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
What an ending. Thank you for the question. Wasn't that great? What an ending to our first day. Robert, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.